So looking at this in plan view, you can see that even regardless of whether this is a single-story building or a multi-story building, in terms of retail, retail ideally wants to be about 60 feet deep. It can work at less of a depth, but there's a point when it gets less than 50 feet when it begins to be problematic. And certainly when it gets deeper than 70 feet, it becomes problematic. So 55 to 65 feet is ideal for retail, with 50 to 70 really being the boundaries that represent the best spot on the bell curve. You can also see that we've designed sidewalks that are 16 feet deep to allow for some active retail attributes, a drive-through on one end of the building, and there's no reason that a drive-through can't be put on a mixed-use building, that allows for the driver's side to be next to the building, which then means that we've been able to put some outdoor seating for presumably a restaurant on the other side of the building. So as you're looking at your projects in plan view, these are all things to be thinking about. So looking at another project, this is a project in Berkeley, California that I designed a number of years ago. We had a larger retail space, just under 6,000 square feet, and then some small retail. We did our best to design as much retail as we could with as close to a 60-foot depth as we possibly could. The 3,400-foot area is less than 60 feet, but the 5,900-foot area I think it's between 55 and 60 if I remember correctly. We also took advantage of traffic circulation to make our garage more efficient. So people could enter the garage where you say retail parking in, and they could go through the garage, see if there was parking, but it was one way. And if somebody wasn't able to find a parking space, rather than have them give up, they were able to make a right-hand turn around the corner of the building, another right-hand turn, and take another stab at the garage without having to go through a lot of hassle to get back into the garage. This efficient circulation allowed us to design retail that ended up being more compelling for retailers to lease. We also, in the middle of the building, designed a pedestrian access from the street to the garage. Retailers don't like to have two entrances if it can be helped, for a variety of reasons. And so this allowed us to have one entrance from all the retail to and from the garage, and we had it with a high ceiling. We'll get back to that in a couple more slides. So in terms of layout, in mixed-use buildings or in existing buildings, because there might be adaptive reuse of older buildings, you've got to look at things like columns, shear walls, vertical penetrations for staircases and elevators, vertical transportation, where are mechanical rooms, where are utilities. There are a lot of different things that go into figuring out how to lay out a space. And in this particular case, we were putting a store in a historic office building, and clearly was not a typical rectangular retail location or facility, but it was in a location that we really liked, and we didn't feel like the facility at the end of the day was worse than our competitors' facilities in the same geographic area. So we were able to lay out a store in this horseshoe pattern and actually make it work. But there were a lot of things that we needed to work around, including all of these things that we chatted about just a moment ago. Similarly, we had a mixed-use project in which we had two anchor tenants on the ground floor. In this particular case, one a drugstore, another a grocery store. And so this is similar to the layout that I showed you just a moment ago. This one where we had a surface parked mixed use spot. And And in this case, we had a lot of parking and truck circulation that we needed to deal with. We couldn't just leave a truck in the parking lot. We had to have a loading dock, and you can see the loading dock over on the left-hand side. All of those lines that you see running through the bottom of the drawing represent the truck turning movement. So what we were doing was testing whether or not the truck could actually get onto the site and then had the correct radiuses to be able to back into the loading dock and then to come back out of the loading dock and make it out of the site. So truck path of travel and then back of house. So we needed to get things from the stockroom to both retailers. So there was a corridor around the back of the building. This is a vertically integrated mixed-use building. So all of these things were really quite complex to be able to accomplish given the constraints on the site. And so looking at things in section view, you can see that we had parking, where the parking is versus where the retail is. And we had residential parking down below on a lower parking deck, retail parking on an upper parking deck on the same level as the retail, and commercial above. So remember at the beginning when we were talking about vertically versus horizontally integrated mixed-use projects, vertically integrated projects get very complex very quickly. And one of the reasons that that happens is that you've got people who live there who want to park conveniently and then get to their homes conveniently, but don't want to end up interacting with the public. So you need to bring those people through the retail podium and up to their homes in a secure way. And you don't want to come home and find people who have just bought sandwiches at the deli on the ground floor sitting in the hallway outside of your apartment or condominium eating their sandwich because it was raining outside. So there are a lot of issues that go into separation of uses and moving different populations vertically through different uses to make these projects work well. In terms of corners, the corners are the most important place in your project for retailers. It allows a retailer to have a presence on two streets. It's the place you're going to get the most rent. But it's also a place that you need to be particularly concerned about design. If for no other reason than if your corner is your most important place, it's not the place that you want to put the residential lobby. It's a place that you want to be very careful thinking about where structural columns are going to be. And you want to be thinking about transparency particularly, and also dimensions. Because you're not going to end up having something that's 60 by 60 feet deep on a hard corner. It's probably a large space, 3,600 square feet. And you're probably going to have the larger depth only on one of the sides and not on both. We're going to get back to shallow depths a little bit later on in the presentation. The corners being very important. Parking, also very important, providing adequate, convenient parking. And the reason I bring this up is that a lot of the mixed use that we're talking about is infill. And a lot of that infill occurs in areas that traditionally have been auto-oriented, but are beginning to become denser, are beginning to see redevelopment and adaptive reuse of projects. So you have a mixed-use project competing against a traditional project. And so the retailer is looking for how to have an equal to or better than facility with respect to any given attribute. Because, think about it this way. If you've got a grocery store on one side of the street and it's a good old-fashioned shopping center, you can pull in, you park in a parking lot, grab a cart, walk in the front door, come out with your groceries, stick them in your car, toss a cart in a cart corral, and off you go. No problem. Versus, let's say that you have an absolutely, in every single respect, identical grocery store literally across the street, and for purposes of this example, with identical access even, and And in this particular case, you've got to go down into a subterranean garage, take a ticket, park, take an elevator or stairs or an escalator up to the store, do your shopping, go take your cart down in an elevator or on a cart conveyor, put your stuff in your car. You forgot to get your ticket stamped. You got to go back upstairs. You get your ticket stamped. You come back downstairs. You get in your car, and then you wait to go through a controlled parking access point in order to exit the building. Which grocery store are you going to? So looking at your mixed-use project through that lens, it's important to understand who your tenants are going to be and who your tenants' competitors are. That was one of the first things we looked at when we were looking at some of the Retail 101 slides earlier, is that you've got to understand your competitors and your competitors' facilities. And so for suburban infill mixed-use development, this is an extremely important conversation to be having in order to design something that's appropriate and that will be successful. Now, the reason that I have a copy of this, that I'm using this photograph, is that this strip center has 3 different kinds of parking, and I wanted you to be able to see the efficiency of each. So over on the left, you have 90-degree two-way aisles. So in other words, you can go up or down each aisle in your car, and the parking is 90-degree. In the middle, you have 60-degree one-way parking. So those parking stalls, 60-degree, they're pretty easy to get in and out because they're 60 instead of 90. But those aisles are unidirectional. In other words, you go up one, down the next, back up the next, down the next. And so that's the most efficient from a parking layout perspective. And then finally, on the far right, you have 60-degree two-way aisles. So in other words, the parking is 60-degree, but you can be going either direction in the aisle. And you can just see by looking at this aerial the efficiency of each. When you're working on mixed-use projects, efficiently using land, and particularly when you have structured parking, becomes very important. So you can begin to see how the 60-degree one-way is important, but you can't have a dead-end aisle. So you need to make sure that you've got enough depth in your project to allow actual circulation in the parking. In the case of the project that I showed you earlier, we didn't have the depth, but we made up for it by using public streets for circulation to give people a second chance at finding parking. So now, in terms of designing parking, you really want to design it in a way that minimizes the perception that it's going to be a hassle. So in other words, having a good defined entrance, having a wide entry, where you see that SUV pulling into the garage, that aperture did not have to be that wide, but having it that wide conveyed that this is an easy parking lot to use, and this is easy retail to patronize by extension. And then finally, looking at the 2 pictures on the right, you can see the difference that 16 inches makes. So you've got one garage with 8'6" clear, and then another with 10 feet clear. And the one with 10 feels much better to be in. And this is going to be particularly important for shoppers that are uncomfortable in these kinds of environments. You have the ability to have something that's better lit, doesn't feel like a cave. You've got better sight lines to where you're going. And then finally, I think it's important to look at shared parking. And ULI really has one of the best white papers on shared parking, which I believe was just updated earlier this year or late last year. But the idea of shared parking is that if you've got multiple uses, the parking for those uses aren't necessarily used at the same time of the day. So for example, the parking for residential is used at night and on weekends, but parking for office is used during the day. And so you can see with this graphic on the right-hand side how the parking can be combined. It's a more efficient use of land, and a lot of the demand for parking can actually be satisfied for different uses using the same parking spaces. And then finally, let's talk about access. And again, we're going to use a suburban shopping center because it illustrates things well. As a retailer, when I would take a project to committee to be approved, I would literally go through how you access the parking from every direction and how I would exit the parking lot in order to go in every direction. So in this particular case, at the hard intersection on the lower left-hand side, you've got a signal, but you've got a signal with U-turns, which means that you've got some important turning movement flexibility with that signal. Going counterclockwise, the main entrance to the shopping center has a left turn pocket, but also has all turns. So you can go in and out of the shopping center from that particular location in any direction. And then going through the shopping center over to the far left, upper left-hand corner, you've got right in, right out, and left in. So there's a left turn pocket to be able to get in, and then you can also enter making a right-hand turn and exit making a right-hand turn. So the direction that's most problematic is if you're exiting the shopping center and you want to go down towards the bottom of your screen. You'd have to exit at the all turns at the bottom and then go and make a left-hand turn. But every other turning movement is easy to make. So for mixed-use projects, it's not likely that you're going to have this kind of flexibility. And so wanting to plan for how turning movements and parking is going to function, access rather, is going to function, is going to be very important in thinking through your project and may have a direct effect on what sort of tenants that you're going to attract. For example, if you're intending for your tenants to be daily needs, convenience-oriented tenants, and you don't have convenient access, you're working across purposes. Whereas if you're a destination, specialty retail component to your project, somebody's going to be willing to go through a bit more hassle in order to park to go to the white tablecloth restaurant. So I want to go through the same access thing, but looking at an anchor tenant. Before I do that, I do want to say I am seeing some questions, and we will get to these at the end. I think we're tracking pretty nicely to be able to start answering questions at about 1/2 and hopefully have a good 30 minutes for that. So please keep posting your questions and know that I'm not ignoring them, but I can't talk and type answers at the same time, but we'll get to them. So continuing on with the slide that you have in front of you, we have a Trader Joe's in a mixed-use project. You can actually see a photograph of the project. And so the loading dock and the residential parking entrance is just above the red outline Trader Joe's, whereas the Trader Joe's parking is behind the store. So the residential parking and the retail parking have been completely segregated from each other, which is a benefit for a number of reasons that we've already discussed. Residents don't have to deal with the public, and the loading has also been put with the parking entrance that's going to have the lower traffic. So fewer residential trips than commercial trips, in other words. So you pull into this parking garage, there's a signal that allows you to get in, and there are going to be 2 store entrances. Now, I said that retailers don't like 2 store entrances, and that is still a rule that I'm going to stand by. However, in this particular case, there was no way around it because you couldn't have the parking near the front door. You're going to have the same issue come up, particularly if you have an anchor tenant or a larger tenant in your project. But if you look at the bottom where it says street entrance, and then just look over, and you'll see a little black box in line with just above the red lower boundary of the Trader Joe's store. Those are the cash wraps. Those are where the checkout occurs. So you have one line of checkout that's actually controlling both entrances to the store. So there wasn't a labor or a or a shrink or theft issue, because they were able to control both entrances with one set of employees and essentially meter people in and out of the store through one location, even though they might go in two separate directions. Looking at the same project from as a section, you can see the residential parking below. You had to get people through the commercial podium level in order to get into the residential. And again, even though this was a larger project, still complicated to be able to do that. And so there are carve-outs for that vertical transportation. So there are places where the site plan is a little goofy for Trader Joe's, because you needed to be able to move people vertically through the project. So let's talk just a moment about shell specifications. And in terms of shell specifications, as you're building a project out, you're going to hear a lot about tenants that, about whether you should, be building out a vanilla box, or whether you should be building out something less than a vanilla box. And particularly on new construction, here's my advice to you. If you build out a vanilla box, the retailer is going to come in and they're going to tear down part of that vanilla box, because they're going to have to run electrical, they're going to have to run mechanical, they're going to have to run plumbing. So if you've got a drop ceiling, the drop ceiling is going to come out so that they can reroute stuff. If you've drywalled and taped or even painted your walls, some of that's going to come out and get re-drywalled again later. That's going to add time to your schedule between when you start construction and when you actually start receiving rent when the retailer opens. My preference, and it's a strong preference, is to deliver the retailer what I call a warm, dark shell. And by warm, dark shell, I mean that you deliver them a dirt floor, a storefront, and you deliver them utilities stubbed to a connection point in their premises. And for HVAC, you have the HVAC in and run to a plenum, so in other words, a stub into the premises, and all of the distribution is left to the tenant. Now, you were going to pay for all that distribution anyway if you were going to do a vanilla box. Better to take the money you were going to spend and move it from tenant build out line item on your pro forma to tenant improvement allowance line item on your pro forma. So you might be in a situation where you were going to spend, let's call it $35 a foot building a vanilla box, and then giving the retailer, let's call it $15 a foot in tenant improvement allowance, for a total of $50 a square foot. I think there's every reason to believe that you might be able to deliver a warm, a raw warm shell here and end up giving the tenant $40 in tenant improvement allowance. You end up having the ability to have a pickup on your pro forma. You're certainly not going to be worse off on your pro forma, but instead of the tenant, you building something out and the tenant taking the time to demo it and rebuild it, you're going to actually get the tenant open faster. You're going to have less general conditions. You're going to have less carry. You're going to have rent sooner. So the shell, how you deliver the space is an extremely important point. Also want to talk about clear height. We talked about it in garage, but let's also talk about it in terms of retail. You've got the bookstore at the left, and you've got the food hall at the right, to the right. And the bookstore has an overly low ceiling, and just like the garage, feels like a cave. It just doesn't necessarily feel like a great place to be. You don't have great sight lines, whereas when you have the higher ceiling, you've got the ability to hang signage from the ceiling. There's a greater volume. It feels better. It feels more open. You've got better sight lines. Also, with the open floor plan or with the open ceiling, you're able to distribute your mechanical and your electrical differently than you might with a drop ceiling. But regardless of whether it's dropped or open ceiling, it's important to have adequate clear height. Now, what does that mean? I think that that means that you have a minimum of 12 to 13 feet clear to the bottom of the ceiling plane. Now, if you have a drop ceiling, the ceiling plane, of course, is your drop ceiling. If you do not have a drop ceiling, the ceiling plane is the level at which your registers for mechanical and your lighting fixtures are all set at. Now, that's for a shop space. If it's an anchor space, it's going to be higher. So working on a project in Iowa right now, there's an old big box retailer. It's vacant. And unfortunately, that big box retailer, I think only has 14 feet clear, to the bottom of the drop ceiling. In this particular case, it's a 110,000 square foot building. So that 14-foot clear, while it might feel great for a space that's 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 square feet, feels terrible for a space that's 110,000 square feet. You're probably not putting 100,000 square foot retail uses in mixed use projects. However, if you are putting a grocery store in, even a modestly sized grocery store like a Trader Joe's, you need to be thinking about higher clear heights. And it's really important to be engaging with the right kind of designer. Let's take just a moment to do a sidebar and talk about that. A lot of mixed use development is driven by residential value. There's more value in the residential, particularly on vertically integrated mixed use projects above, than there is on the retail on the ground level. Hopefully, by applying the principles that we're talking about in this project, you're going to be able to increase the value of the ground level, but it still might not rise to the level of the residential. So, residential architects are often the ones that end up designing mixed-use projects, including the ground floor. And it's very important to include somebody knowledgeable about retail to, at a minimum, peer review what the residential expert has designed so that adjustments can be made on paper when it's cheap, rather than getting to the actual finished structure only to find that you have a facility that doesn't meet retailers' needs, yet the desire or the requirement to put retail in that facility. Another thing that comes up as an aside is that often cities will look up and say, hey, we've got a 55-foot height restriction. And because the project's being driven by residential and a 9-foot ceiling is better than an 8-foot ceiling in a residential condominium or apartment, it's going to get more rent, it's going to feel better. What ends up happening is the retail podium ends up getting squashed down to make room for the attributes that accrue to the sale or leasability of the residential. The city, on the other hand, probably is very keen to have dynamic, active retail space on the ground level. Yet you've got 10 or 11 feet clear, which isn't really enough to work for retail, or maybe even less in some cases. And the height restriction is the thing that's driving that. This is the time that I go with the client to the city and say, look, you have a height restriction that is across purposes of having active retail space, and I explain this problem to them, and then we really enter into the discussion of, do you really care if this building is 3 feet higher or 4 feet higher? And the answer always is no, but that's the code, or that's the design guidelines. Like, okay. Well, you want to accomplish multiple things, and in order for the project to work financially, we need these attributes on the residential, but in order for the retail to work, we need these attributes on the retail. And why don't we go for a variance on this thing that we all already know nobody cares about? So just a sidebar when it comes to clear height.